So good evening, everyone. Today, our panel discussion is on childhood sexual abuse and its effects on mental health. Uh, to help us understand this topic and to sensitize us towards this issue, we have Dr. John Vijay Kumar Vijay Sagar Kommu, Professor and Head, Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, NIMHANS, with us, and also Dr. Vaijayanti Subramaniam, Consultant Psychiatrist, Indian Institute of Science. They will be giving presentations about the topic of discussion, followed by we'll be taking followed by some of the questions, answering some of the questions. So before we begin, I would request Professor Anil Kumar, Chair of the Wellness Center Committee, IIC, to give a brief introduction.
Yeah, thank you, Nishant. First of all, let me welcome Dr. John Vijay Sagar and Dr. Vaijayanti for this panel discussion. And thank you for your time and effort to help the IIC community in this regard. And Wellness Center was conducting a lot of sessions aiming at the emotional well-being of the campus community. And Empaths is a part of the Wellness Center. This is a student group who is a peer support group helping students to cope up with many of the problems that they are facing. And they interact with the students very effectively and help the Wellness Center also to make sure that the emotional well-being of students are being taken care of. We have Dr. Vaijayanti as one of the consultant psychiatrists. We have a panel in our Wellness Center with Dr. Ajit Bide and Dr. Naren from NIMHANS. So they are helping us. And now we have a Wellness Center with many activities that's being happening in the campus. And one of such activities are these panel discussions. And we also recently appointed two psychiatric social workers in the campus, and they are staying in the hostel. And I would like to inform that from 1st January, we are also having a panel of psychiatrists and psychologists who will be helping us. So students can go to those psychiatrists and psychologists which are enlisted in the panel without any referral from IIC, and also you don't have to make payments to the respective doctors. So they will be sending their bills to IIC and IIC will take care of it. So the modalities of that will be announced in the coming week in the Wellness Center website. And from 1st January onwards, students have this additional opportunity apart from Dr. Vaijayanti, and also we have two campus psychologists. So we are widening our pool so that students can go to get expert help. And today we have a topic, childhood sexual abuse and its effect on the mental health. We are very fortunate to have two leading experts in this area here. So welcome all for this meeting. And once again, thank you, Dr. John Vijay Sagar and Dr. Vaijayanti for accepting our invitation. The students are doing a wonderful job here. So thank you once again. So over to you, Nishant.
Thank you, sir. I request Dr. John to, he can start the presentation whenever he's ready. Yeah. Yes, sir, your screen is visible. You can start. Yeah, thank you.
Good evening to all. At the outset, I thank Wellness Center Indian Institute of Science for this wonderful initiative, Empaths, on the campus. So it's one of its kind initiative in Bangalore, and truly I would like to see the other institutions also to emulate this initiative as we go along. And the topic for today's discussion is impact of child sexual abuse on the mental health. I also thank my co-presenter, Dr. Vaijayanti. So she would be covering certain aspects, and I will start off my presentation. So The outline of my presentation is given on this slide. First and foremost, let us look at when to suspect sexual abuse in children and what are the emotional and behavioral indices for the same, followed by how does sexual abuse traumatize a child, and in terms of the adverse mental health sequelae of child sexual abuse, what are the common disorders what we encounter in children, and how do children seek help, and what are the therapeutic interventions that are available for children and families. So first and foremost, the suspicion about child sexual abuse is we can say that we can look at this pyramid that is given on the slide, and at the bottom of the pyramid there are certain behavioral patterns, certain symptoms which the child may display. For example, sudden onset of any somatic complaints like aches and pains, sudden onset of bedwetting, and also any unexplained changes in the behavior. Suddenly the child refusing attendance to school or avoiding certain people. And sometimes more clearer symptoms of a psychological disorder could be depression or a post-traumatic stress disorder. And overt sexual behavior, sexualized behaviors in child, which gives a clear hint of child sexual abuse. And also sexually transmitted infections in children, or presence of any genital injuries, or when an adolescent becomes pregnant. And last but not the least, the direct disclosure by the child, either to the parent or any other adult within the family, and sometimes in the mental health setting to the mental health professional. So let us look at the emotional and behavioral indices in the younger children. There are a range of these indices: sexualized behavior, avoidance of specific adults, sleep difficulties, and flashback phenomena and nightmares in the form of fearful dreams in the sleep, clingy behavior, separation anxiety, expressing intense fear and anxiety, school refusal, bedwetting, decreased scholastic performance, and medically unexplained aches and pains. In the older children and adolescents, self-harm, presence of depressive symptoms, anger, fearfulness and anxiety, sleep disturbance with nightmares and flashbacks, again avoidance behavior and school refusal, decreased scholastic performance. And the last point I would like to highlight, the high risk behaviors that could include high risk sexual behaviors, substance use behaviors, and also a runaway. So to understand the complex influence of child sexual abuse on the child, traumagenic dynamics model is one theoretical model that has been proposed by Finkelhor and Brown in way back in 1986. And according to this model, the trauma much before the actual trauma of abuse, the dynamics are present in the child before the trauma and during the process of abuse and after the abuse. So there are four key aspects or dynamics that needs to be considered. First and foremost is what we call as traumatic sexualization, followed by stigmatization, betrayal, and powerlessness. So in traumatic sexualization, the child's sexuality is altered by the perpetrator, and the whole event of sexual abuse can shape the child's sexuality. Stigmatization is the perception of self-perception that is in the child. The child starts feeling bad, guilty, responsible for the abuse. Betrayal, both against the perpetrator as well as against the adults who fail to protect. And also the child's powerlessness. Basically, child feels that repeatedly they get overruled, and they perceive a sense of threat or injury to themselves. So each of these things, what is the psychological and behavioral impact? Let us look at closely. And for traumatic sexualization, the perpetrator who abuses a child basically confuses the child about his or her own sexual identity, and a lot of importance is given to the sexual issues in the child, and the child gets confused. The perpetrator uh, starts confusing the child by uh, saying that what he or she is showing is love and affection, and then the child is slowly involved in sexual activity with the child for his or her age is not able to understand or comprehend, and also causing a lot of negative associations with the sexual activities, and finally an aversion to sexual intimacy. In terms of behavioral impact, the traumatic sexualization can result in sexual preoccupations and compulsive sexual behaviors, and precocious sexual activity, and aggressive sexual behaviors, and even engagement in promiscuous sexual behaviors, or even prostitution, and sexual dysfunctions, uh, and difficulty in attaining arousal and orgasm, like especially when they become adults. This is a long-term effect, and also avoidance and phobic reactions to sexual intimacy as a long-term effect. The stigmatization, the second aspect, it creates a lot of guilt and shame in the child, and self-esteem of the child is lowered, and child feels different from the others, and child as a consequence, child isolates himself or herself from others, and may uh, engage in drug use or certain criminal kind of behaviors, can also engage in self-harm behaviors. The impact of betrayal includes development of grief and depression, extreme dependency on the adults who are non-perpetrators, and also impaired ability to judge and trust others, and the constant mistrust, particularly of men, more so because most of the perpetrators in general are males, and anger and hostility, clinging and being very vulnerable, being isolated, and showing aggression, discomfort in intimate relationships, and even long-term effects, marital problems, allowing own children to get victimized. And the last point of powerlessness, it creates a lot of anxiety and fear, lowered sense of efficacy, perception of self as a victim, and identification with the aggressor sometimes. And behavioral impact includes development of somatic complaints, nightmares, phobias, depression, dissociation, running away behaviors, vulnerability to subsequent victimization, uh, and in some people becoming an abuser themselves. So this last point, uh, it's not that all the victims of child sexual abuse eventually become perpetrators or abusers themselves. It's in a small uh, number of people this particular victim abuser cycle may be seen. So then there is also this concept of child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome, which was given by Roland Summit in 1983. So victims, they face secondary trauma in the crisis of discovery, and either the child disclosing by themselves or the adult finding out. Uh, the adults accuse the child of lying, manipulating, and imagining the abuse. And the very same adults who are meant to protect the child and nurture the child, if they abandon the child, then the child goes deeper into self-blame, self-hate, alienation, and this serves as secondary traumatization or secondary victimization. So the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome has these points: secrecy. There is sense of secrecy. Child maintains that secrecy because any disclosure is bound to, again, no, the adults are going to respond with not believing the child's version, and also the child going into deeper sense of helplessness. Then there is this entrapment and accommodation. Over a period of time, the disclosure also is delayed, and the child may eventually retract whatever he or she has stated about the abuse. So coming to the help seeking patterns, help seeking usually happens either by referral by a pediatrician or a teacher to the mental health professional, or through agencies such as Child Welfare Committee or Special Juvenile Police Unit if the case has been already filed, or by any specific child NGOs who are working in the area of child sexual abuse. Sometimes they are brought by a parent for psychological or behavioral symptoms, not knowing that the child has been abused. But during the process of evaluation of these symptoms, the child may disclose to the therapist about the abuse experience. And sometimes the child may have reported to the parent, and then parent may bring the child for mental health interventions. There are also certain instances where there may be ongoing marital conflict between a couple, and there may be perpetration of child abuse in that context, or sometimes rarely the false allegations also about one of the partners having perpetrated abuse on the child. So coming to the common psychiatric disorders, this slide shows some of our experience a few years back, wherein the psychiatric morbidity has been found to be about close to 60 to 70% of children who have faced abuse having a psychiatric diagnosis. And out of that, depressive disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder being the most common conditions, followed by adjustment disorder, conduct and dissociative disorder. So long-term outcomes of child sexual abuse, there are certain factors that can negatively impact the long-term outcome. Early age at first abuse episode, number of abuse episodes, longer duration of abuse, and if there is any use of threat or coercion during the abuse, and history of parental mental illness, and last but not the least, the abuse by a father or a father figure. So not all children who face this abuse experience develop psychological disorders, and some of them are quite resilient, and in fact about 18 to 20% of children who face child sexual abuse may never develop a psychiatric disorder. And these people are the term coined for this group of people are called as asymptomatic survivors. And the resilience is promoted by support from their parents. If there is no past history of abuse, if it's only a single incident, and the child having higher emotional self-control, and interpersonal trust and feelings of empowerment, and lesser personal attributions of blame and stigmatization, secure attachment relationship, especially with the parents, and high family functioning. So finally, in the interventions, what we address in the child is that the self-blame, the low self-esteem, the depression, and guilt, fear, and the child's internal feeling saying that he or she is damaged, and also the anger that is repressed, usually that is within the child, and usually anger sometimes may manifest behaviorally as aggression towards others, and difficulty trusting people, and also blurred generational boundaries and role confusion, and also sometimes displaying what we call as pseudo maturity, behaving as if they are much older than their age, and masking the failure to have completed the certain developmental tasks. So this is something very important. As abuse happens in children at a younger age, their development also can get impacted adversely, and this has to be taken care of in therapy. And last but not the least, the control and mastery over self. So at our center, we use particular approach is called the workbook approach. There are workbooks that are available for therapists who work with children who are abused as well as the adolescents who are abused. And we first establish rapport, then we explore the trauma, and we work with the child and repair the sense of self. And lastly, we focus on becoming future oriented. And interventions with the family are very important. So this slide summarizes the key domains of the intervention. On one hand, the psychoeducation of the caregivers, on the other hand, the legal aspects. So understanding and validating the distress of families, helping them remove the blame from themselves and the child, focusing on what needs to be done, and normalizing the child's routine, understanding the mental health issues and ensuring the safety of the child. Then the legal process as mandated under the POCSO Act 2012. So starting from the mandatory reporting of the abuse to involving child welfare committee for the support, and also whatever the follow-up assistance that family requires, that will be provided. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. John, for the presentation on the different aspects of childhood sexual abuse. I'm sure it has helped us to understand the various causes, the signs to notice, and the several therapy and support pathways that are available. I would request Dr. Vaijayanti to begin a presentation whenever she's ready.
Can I start? Are you able to hear me? Are you able to hear me?
We can hear you, but the screen has some problem.
You're not able to see me. Is it? Can you see the slides?
We can see you, hear your voice, but slides are not proper.
Can you see the screen now? Now?
Probably you need to unshare once and then share it again.
Yeah.
Nishant, can you please help her to?
Yeah. Now it is fine.
Okay. Can you hear now? Can you see?
Yes, ma'am. It's you're visible, and the presentation is also visible. Yeah.
Okay. I would like to start by saying that it's quite obvious that we live in a less than a perfect world where childhood abuse does happen. And if all were, at least if the corrective systems were in place, childhood abuse must be discovered in childhood and intervened in childhood. That does not happen in most of the cases. Therefore, we end up finally hearing about child abuse either from young adults or older adults, sometimes, adults who are getting their children married come to me saying that I was abused as a child and that I feel the impact now. So why does it take so long for people to actually come up and talk about it? And what happens when they actually face this, when they get back this memory? Okay, so what happened to them all these years? Why did they keep quiet? That's a question we often ask. See, post-traumatic stress disorder, delayed expression is the most common term we could use. And as Professor John already described, all the symptoms are more or less the same, okay, of whatever the child post-traumatic stress disorder or adult post-traumatic stress disorder. But the one thing is, usually dissociation is the cause why very often children were not able to recall. Now, how is dissociation different from other experiences is abuse amnesia is a word we would often use. I've been told not to use a lot of psychiatric jargon by my clients and a few students. And see, what we mean by that amnesia is that all of us have like negative memories. And what do? We suppress them. So that
excuse
yeah.
me, ma'am. Excuse me, ma'am. I just want to confirm whether the slides are visible because I can't see them. Sudeep, can you confirm?
I also cannot see
your slides are not visible, ma'am.
I have to then again do something.
Yeah. Ma'am, in the share content, please select desktop so that everything you open on the desktop is visible.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is this visible now?
No, ma'am. Yeah, now it's visible. Yeah.
Now it's visible?
Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
Okay. So I probably will continue in the same way.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
Okay. So the latency. So what is the reason for this amnesia? Amnesia is for survival purpose. People often, what we consciously suppress memory is different from when you unconsciously split off a memory because that's the only way you can live. So the splitting off is what we call as dissociation. So it's not that you don't remember, you don't even remember that you don't remember. Okay, so that is the only state in which you can sustain yourself for so many years without it having affected you at all. So it is, why do you finally remember? The trigger can be a relationship, demand for intimacy, or a sensory neural reminder. It can be as simple as something associated with the abuser or abusive environment. Those kinds of reminders are quite common. So how does trauma come back? Does it come back as a memory? Not necessarily. This is what Bessel van der Kolk said, that trauma comes back as a reaction and not always as a memory. Now, if I had to describe, I met an adult survivor of child sexual abuse who was manhandled, literally mauled in an amusement park, and as a child, when she was about 15 years old. And her teacher witnessed the whole thing, but did not complain, did not told the child to keep quiet. And the whole incident was hushed up. It was one-off incident, but the victim did not remember it until much later when she started compulsively arranging everything in her room. And it became to the extent that every object could not be removed from its original space. and she had a horror of going to public spaces, and she experienced stage fright. So it came back as a reaction, and then we had to go back, rebuilding, trying to find out, and finally we did find out what happened. Now, what happens? Victim becomes the victimizer. I'm not saying that the victimization will be full blown or will be as bad as what happened to the victim, but a superficial semblance of a behavior simulating an abuser in order to gain control over the experience is something that I have noticed in a lot of children. And sometimes we call it as repetition compulsion. That is, the child gets into a similar kind of relationships, abusive relationships, where he or she tries to gain control over the abusive experience by acting out, like acting out as if she is or he is a victimizer rather than the victim. So acting out behavior is seen, repetition compulsion of getting into repeatedly relationships which are not satisfying, which are self-defeating, that is also seen. And of course, all psychiatric diagnosis, every psychiatric diagnosis that you can think of, major depression, anxiety disorders, bipolar affective disorders, dissociative disorders, eating disorders, substance abuse disorders, all of them could be expressions of child abuse. And of course, they are all multifactorial. I'm not going to attribute it only to child sexual abuse, but child sexual abuse does play a very important role in many of these disorders from what we have seen. Okay, so what really happens when it comes to repetition compulsion? There's this psychiatrist called Leoty, who I think as early as 1988 spoke about Kaufman's drama triangle, where he says that children get into repetitive triangles where they are either the victim or the rescuer or an abuser in a romantic relationship. For someone who has never ever had a sexual abusive experience, they do not regard sexual interaction to be in paradigms of power. Okay, they think of it in paradigm of sexuality as intimacy only. But people who have been through abuse look upon even a romantic liaison in a paradigm of power. And moment they are romantically attracted to somebody, they are afraid of becoming a victim. They are afraid of re-traumatization. So very often they take to fight or flight or freeze or please, all these reactions which are well known by the adrenergic response. Some of them will, most often, many of them will choose to become rescuers. I think some of us psychiatrists, therapists, psychotherapists, psychologists, psychiatric social workers might also be in that category. Okay, people who decided, okay, I'm going to rescue. Now, what happens? There is a small percentile who end up becoming an abuser. If I have to become, I don't want to become a victim, I rather become an abuser. Now, you'll find that a lot of people do, what you call, give a grandiose sense of self to the rescuer. If you look at God of Small Things of Arundhati Roy, or if you were to look at Alice Walker's Color Purple, you'll find that rescuers are being thought of like Superman. Okay, so this entire drama triangle is very often created in the fantasy of child sexual abuse. And they keep repeating that. What should services focus on? There is something called post-traumatic growth. I've seen lots and lots of survivors of child sexual abuse in Indian Institute of Science itself. And so I think post-traumatic growth is a well-known entity. You would not be making it to the most premier institute in this country if such a thing did not exist. So services should focus on the inherent potential for recovery of every person, whether a person is currently overwhelmed by trauma and enhancing their self-worth, and making their sense of subjective well-being, self-knowledge of what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses, that also helps. Okay, and what are the enabling factors? Very often guilt plays a very important role. So a significant other who strongly said they were not to be blamed no matter what. So self-blame is the strongest inhibiting factor, and victim blaming, victim shaming is very, very common in some cultures which are very repressive, India being one of them. I'm sorry that messages come very late, long after the original abuse ended, and ongoing support from others, having someone for them, etc. These things do enable a person to come out of it. I thought the best way to demonstrate it would be a case report of one of the patients that I saw in early years of practice. A 19-year-old girl presented with anxiety in public spaces and with fear of talking in social situations, including public speaking, lack of self-esteem, hopelessness, helplessness for several years. I went on treating her for social phobia with behavioral treatment and cognitive behavior treatment, pharmacotherapy, etc. Then at one point, she told me, listen, you're not getting me at all. I said, what is it that I'm not getting? She said, it's not that I'm scared to speak. My voice fails. My voice does not come out. There are episodes during which I want to speak, but I can't speak. And that is dissociation. It's a conversion of a psychological conflict into a somatic symptom. And we call it as aphonia. So the dissociative aphonia was a revision of diagnosis, which was made after 8 months. Now, does this, was I so hopeless and pathetic? Not necessarily, because dissociation is very difficult to pick up. Okay, especially discrete episodes of dissociation. And finally, after she got this diagnosis, that dissociative aphonia, phonetics is speech, and aphonia is unable to speak. Dissociative aphonia is when you are, you have cut off that particular function. Now, when I explained to her that dissociation is often a reaction to trauma, I was going by what Dr. John was saying, that I was describing the traumatogenic model of, not able to get her voice. And she looked at me and demanded for hypnosis. And then I said, I think we have good enough therapeutic alliance. Is there anything you want to tell me that was traumatic for you in childhood? And then she came up with a series of incidents of repeated sexual abuse when she was less than around the age of 6. And the patient's father was alcohol dependent, mother was a banker, and she did not know how to put it into words. She blamed herself for not telling. She kept going to this creche for almost 3 years. And she said that she did not remember, she had forgotten the abuse for almost 8 years. And she recalled acting out, in the sense like she behaved like an abuser with younger children. And she did not recall any adult intervention. So after disclosure, she made sense of abuse. Why me? Why then? Who could have prevented it? Who should have? What could be done about it? Etc. Then patient had presumed all children were treated the same way. So the ritual of calling out her name before abuse used to be the trigger for dissociative episodes. Not being able to tell had recurred as a symptom, conversion of a psychic conflict into a physical symptom or a flashback. Anger towards the babysitter who ignored the abuse meted out to the victim was enacted in transference. Helplessness and inability to get justice, concern for other victims was there. After disclosure, there was grief and there was mild depression for some time, and that was treated with medication. I don't think I'll go into the neurobiological processing of trauma, though whoever is interested in neurosciences, I can later share these slides with you. And usually there are frameworks by which people to recover. Okay, they want to live the family legacy, and determining their sexuality becomes very important because they think that sex means no feeling, sex is merely for material gain, sex is mandatory or duty in the marriage, things like that. And storing violence, telling what happened, how it was connected to other emotional events. So narrative therapy helps a lot, and being delivered an end of tunnel experience happens, and helping and altruism is there in many people. So she experienced positive growth at work, was able to make presentations, told her sister and mother. She no longer felt caged or isolated. She started making contact with other people, including members of the opposite sex. Currently, she is happy in a long-term commitment. So integrating the experience of trauma with other aspects of self and making a connection with traumatic memories removed the power it had on her daily functioning. And currently, intimacy is not a challenge for her. I had to revise this last part because she contacted me just 1 month back to tell me that she's doing well. Okay, so victim is just a part of the self, not the whole self. So stand up to the stigma, and let's look upon mental health. Thank you so much for giving me this platform for talking about this, this important topic.
Oh. Thank you, Dr. Vaijayanti, for the very informative presentation and for a very sensitizing presentation on the challenges faced by adult survivors of childhood abuse, and also for the case study. We will go ahead with the questions. I had shared the document with you. I'll begin with Dr. John, and I'll start going alternately. There are a few questions coming up during the event also, like right now. I'll take them in between. So we'll begin with the questions. The first question is as follows. My question concerns physical abuse as opposed to childhood, as opposed to sexual abuse. I've read that PTSD manifests itself in adulthood in some cases of child abuse. In such a scenario, what can a patient do to attempt to deal with the depression and trauma of the abuse if they are not ready to meet a therapist or a psychiatrist? And how can they deal with being forced to interact with their abuser in case they are close family? So, Dr. John, yeah.
Yeah. This question pertains to physical abuse. So first and foremost, any maltreatment of children, whether it's physical abuse or emotional abuse, sexual abuse, is traumatic. That is something we all need to remember. And oftentimes, the physical and emotional abuse are quite common, though we don't talk about it. And we often feel that it's less common, and the children generally they get over it like that, we may feel. So physical abuse, especially if it is harsh physical abuse and if it's repetitive, can definitely result in conditions like depression, post-traumatic disorder, not just in childhood, but even it may continue into their adulthood. And in this question, it has been mentioned that the person who is the victim doesn't want to seek therapeutic support.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
So in that case, like the options would be limited, I would say, especially if they have developed PTSD symptoms. Because PTSD is a severe psychological condition which requires the support of a mental health professional, and the limited options would be basically taking the support from any trusting relationship within the family, if they have a parent or an adult sibling, or either an uncle or aunt, whoever it is, with whom they can trust and confide, and also who can be a person who can provide unconditional support to them, so that they can ventilate these experiences of physical abuse that has been afflicted during their childhood. And also there are they can actually, like, if they are able to express themselves through art or different forms of the art mediums, they can express some of the trauma through that, and it's said to be therapeutic in itself. And also another mechanism is actually with their peer group. That's where if they have one or two close friends, they can discuss with them. And also there are a lot of lot of material nowadays, because internet is accessible, a lot of useful material that is available over internet, where they can strengthen themselves mentally by following some of the practices that are available on the internet. Though if at a later point, if anywhere they feel that going to the therapist is a must, if it continues, the symptoms continues, that will be the best.
Okay. Thank you, sir. We'll go ahead with the next question. So the person who wrote this is a male, 25-year-old, and he's saying a female did something to me and in turn he did something to his cousin of the same age when he was a teenager, and from that point I was never able to talk to girls, and now I don't have any female friends. It's hard with life to moving forward. It was a teenage when it happened, but it still haunts him. I have to meet both persons and act normal. Still don't know how to handle it currently. I'm working and still unable to talk alone with women. First time I'm disclosing, and he wishes to be anonymous. I can't handle the fact that I repeated a similar act to someone else. So this question is for Dr. Vaijayanti. I hope you can see the document I've shared with you.
Yeah, I think that this person has perhaps acted out because of the behavior of sexualized behavior of one of the cousins on him. He has reacted on another girl, is what he thinks, that it was an acting out behavior. Now, I would like to say that acting out behavior is not inherently pleasurable, to make a very important point. It is actually to gain psychological control over an experience. So feeling guilty is something that he should stop, because he is not responsible for the abuse that happened to him. And I'm not too sure what he did to the other girl. He's not describing the act. So I don't know how sexualized that act was, and what was the distress or experience by the other person. We have no idea. All I can see is that he is victim blaming and victim shaming himself, and he thinks he's an abuser. I'm not too sure if he is really an abuser or not, because that acting out behavior, how much of distress it caused the other person, I don't know. And whether that acting out behavior was perceived as a play, was it an interactive play? Was there any contribution from the other person? Were there any adults who supervised them? I have no clue. So basically, I think that I would look upon him, with what limited information is available, as a survivor of child sexual abuse who is tormented by guilt. And I would basically think that he needs to address that. So I'm not looking at him as a perpetrator the way he seems to be looking at himself as a perpetrator. Because I told you, acting out is very different from inherently sexually pleasurable behavior. And that does not happen in childhood. It happens much later.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for the answer. The next question is slightly long, descriptive. So the person says, I have some incidents in childhood. I don't know whether it was child abuse or what. It happened to be during the age of 6 to 10. I got sexually active with my tenant, who was 5 years older than me. Except intercourse, everything happened during that time. While playing on rooftop, he used to play with my private parts. I took it as a game and made him do the same every day. Then after, I got involved with 2 more boys playing sexually. I always thought it's a game. I really didn't know during that time whether that was a good or a bad thing. Gradually, when I grew up and entered the age of puberty, it started haunting me as if I did some kind of sin. I used to have sleepless nights thinking about this. I got insecure and had the view that if I tell to anyone, then I won't be alive. From that point, I started secluding myself. I became very lonely. I go through the feeling of helplessness. I still don't know what was that, but those memories haunt me like anything. So this question is for Dr. John.
Yeah. So to answer this question, the first instance where one of the adults, I presume that it's a person who is older adolescent or an adult who is clearly 5 years above age of this person,
Yeah.
had some form of sexual activity with this person.
Yeah.
So it used to happen repeatedly. So here we can probably we have to understand that the older person, if if that is the age difference of about 5 years, or if that person is an adult, it
Yeah.
would constitute an abusive experience. And typically what happens is that person would have been a known person, a neighbor, or
Yeah.
someone known to the child. Sometimes we see that it can be one of the family members also,
Mhm.
who might actually, like, sometimes they may start off by becoming very close to this child, and they may, we use the word grooming for that. So
Yeah.
they may use the process of grooming to become very close to the child and then perpetrate this activity.
Yes.
And also, as I mentioned in my slides, the confusion that happens, the traumatic sexualization part, wherein during the process of abuse, the perpetrator confuses the child with regards to their sexuality and their uh, sexual identity itself. And even as they come into adolescence, sometimes uh, even the normal adolescent sexual exploration also, sometimes
Yeah.
they start blaming themselves, saying that
Mhm.
they are the abuser. I think
Yeah.
Dr. Vaijayanti also mentioned in the previous question, saying that probably that person is not the abuser, has not turned into abuser.
Yeah.
And this is normal around the age of puberty, the sexual exploration that may happen both in boys and girls.
Yeah.
And subsequently, actually, because of the first instance wherein that person probably groomed and repeated sexual activity happened,
Yeah.
uh, the this person no, has developed a guilt, uh,
Yeah.
guilt and self blame, lot of self blame, and also a very low self esteem, and
Yeah.
trying to avoid any relationships, like saying that with the fear that no uh, there is also an intense fear that anyone with whom they come into contact, I may abuse that person. So that also is one
Okay.
phenomenon which we may see. And avoiding all kinds of closeness, and all kinds of friendships or any other relationship. Yeah. And I would
Okay.
say that that first instance is definitely an abuse, and later on whatever has happened, the person need not blame himself or herself,
Okay.
and
Okay.
he should just take some support and talk about these issues, and should be free of any guilt or shame or anything like that. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, thank you, sir. We'll take one of the questions that was asked like recently. Um, what can I do as a friend to help my friend, female, who was sexually abused multiple times during her childhood? This is for Dr. Vaijayanti. I mean, both of you can answer. But yeah.
Uh, I presume that she happens to be a girlfriend, or is she just a platonic friend? I don't know, because
Yes. Yes.
there
Yeah.
is there are limitations in a platonic friendship. You can at best express empathy. You can express understanding. Like you can help with respect to material. You can provide the person about materials about abuse and how to overcome the feeling of disempowered. And fourth would be helping a person to feel more and more empowered in the relationship. If it is not a platonic friendship, if it is a romantic friendship, then allowing her to take the lead, especially in their physical interactions and in their romantic interactions, about like where do they want to go and what time to what time they want to go, what does she want to eat, give her the lead, make her take the initiative, and in some ways it will empower her and take her to places where she feels safe, and repeatedly ask her if she feels safe, and do not suddenly surprise her, and do not suddenly throw some unpleasant things at her, because they are usually hyper vigilant, they are guarded, and they are very scared of interpersonal interaction. And each time she reveals some intimate detail, kindly be supportive, reassure her repeatedly that you are not judging her, you are not making her feel small, you're not you're not there like passing on judgments like, what did she do right, did she do wrong, etc.
Okay.
Anything that she did to survive that situation is okay by you. Okay, so it is something that you have to, these are the ways in which you can support a friend, in, I think, whether in platonic friendship or in romantic friendship.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. There's another question, like the question number 6. I think the first part has been answered. My partner has faced sexual abuse in childhood. How should I comfort my partner? What should I and what should I not do? So is there something they should not do? Can you like continue on that? Question number 6 in the document. The first part, I think you've answered just now, but what is there something that they shouldn't be doing?
Dr. John, would you like
Dr. John?
Yes.
Anybody?
So what one should not be doing is one should one should not probe too much of things when that person who has faced the abuse is not ready. Even if he or she is in a relationship, like here it's mentioned that he's a partner or she's a partner. So one need to respect the other person, and even in the relationship also, that mutual respect, that trust, that confidentiality, these things are very important. And also if they're willing to share their experiences, we have to we have to allow that person to share that experience at their own pace, and we should not hurry them through the thing. And being non-judgmental also is very important, which Dr. Vaijayanti has earlier highlighted. Rather than any kind of blaming or any kind of trying to say that in a way you are responsible or something like that, or getting into this preachy kind of mode, like saying that and also some kind of moral kind of lectures, so that's not warranted. And also providing unconditional support, so whatever that person reveals, sometimes even the like what we need to remember is whether it's a friend or a life partner or whoever it is, when something like this is shared, even for the person who has to support the victim of abuse, it's it can be quite traumatic. And that's something many of us as mental health professionals also, when we work with the children as well as adults, face this kind of experiences we go through, because like reliving some of the traumatic experiences and just listening to those things itself can be quite traumatic. And so like this person who basically tries to provide the support, the partner should be ready for that, like. And they should also take care of their own mental health. That is something, it's like no, I would give the example of in the aeroplanes, when we travel, when we try to wear the life jacket, they'll say that first you put on your jacket and then help the others. So like that, first these people also has to ensure that they have to take care of their mental health, and then support, offer whatever plausible support. And definitely sometimes no, not sometimes, often it is seen that just one person cannot help. Like it may be more number of people. So some of the times actually we see that a formal therapeutic intervention is definitely required by the mental health professional. That should not be delayed. Sometimes taking up too much upon themselves and saying that I am there as a life partner, I can support everything. No, that doesn't help. That approach doesn't help.
Thank you, sir. The next question will be taking from the document shared only. What effect does childhood sexual abuse have on sexuality of a victim? Say a boy was sexually abused by a man during his childhood. Would that affect his sexual orientation in some sense?
Yeah, I would like to answer that question.
Yeah. Okay.
So it is when we look at sexual orientation, that is, say, either heterosexual or a same-sex kind of orientation. So it's something that has been shown in studies that, especially during, it's an evolving, concept during the latter part of adolescence and in the young adult period. And
Okay.
also once they during childhood, definitely it's quite I would say that a very fluidic kind of concept. And
Okay.
so what studies have shown is that abuse in itself is not causally related to any alteration of sexual orientation.
Okay.
So and people with either hetero or the same-sex kind of orientation, both the groups have almost similar rates of child sexual abuse, prevalence rates of child sexual abuse that has been reported in the literature.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, sir. The next question is slightly longer. I have read the child. The question goes: I have read the Child on Child Sexual Abuse COCSA survivor children. That I have read that COCSA survivor children are likely to indulge in sexual behavior with other younger children. In such a case, how does a COCSA survivor can get over with the guilt that they were consensually sexually involved with another younger child? If two close friends, both 9 to 12 years old, were sexually involved with each other consensually, could it still be abusive for the younger child? What defines consent among children of that age? Is sexual exploration between two children a normal behavior, or can we say that since children are not capable of giving consent, such behavior would always mean abuse to the younger child? Dr. Vaijayanti, can you answer this?
This is tricky to answer because it depends upon, it's very clearly mentioned that it was consensual and there was no coercion. And therefore, and what if the other person found it also pleasurable is what this person presumes. Now, what exactly childhood sexuality is? We are all born with erogenous zones in the body, and self-stimulation of some areas themselves can cause pleasure. And this has been noted in children even less than 1 year, and later on at 3 years, and later on at 5 years. So you have the equipment, but until puberty and the actual hormones kick in, the desire for sex or the desire for sexual gratification is not known to occur, biologically speaking. So this could be, at best, simulation or imitation of behavior is what I would say. And perhaps self-stimulating behavior in the same way they have stimulated each other, perhaps because they have been exposed to this, this kind of treatment or this kind of abuse. Now, the guilt part of it is, I would give the same explanation as what I would say for somebody who is guilty about, masturbation. I think you have assisted somebody in masturbation. I'm not too sure. And if it was consensual and if it was coercive, did the other person resist? And even if the other person did not resist, if you do feel guilty all I can say is that you were also a child. So I don't know how to look upon this. I only feel that actually, if you look at the Finkelhor and one more person's 4 models of abuse, he does talk about lack of parental supervision leading to sexually explorative play between children, and one of them being older, as also this child-on-child kind of abuse. Now, here I would put the onus of responsibility more on supervision by adults rather than on you as a child, and therefore harboring unnecessary feelings of guilt and inhibiting yourself over this experience may not be serving the purpose for anybody, neither for you nor for the other person. And if you can have a talk, or if you can uh, interact with that person at a later date, that could still clear the matter to some extent. And you could meet the person in the presence of a therapist, and where a dialogue can be meaningful, dialogue can be initiated, and you can understand from his point of view what did he experience, and so that perhaps can clarify a lot of things.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. We'll go to the next question. One second. The next question is, a girl of 7 years old was mistreated by her own cousin of 15 years old. How to handle both of them, and will there be a psychiatric issue with the girl later on? I'm presuming this being asked by a parent, so parent or caretaker. So Dr. John. Yeah.
Yes. So here we see that the girl's age is 7 and the cousin is around 15, and it is mentioned that the mistreatment. Really, to what extent the abuse has happened, that we need to first explore. And but definitely the child being older, if it involves what we call a contact kind of abuse, whether it's a penetrative or non-penetrative kind of contact abuse, we need to take it seriously. And the 15-year-old child, the adolescent basically, who had done this act on the younger child, that child also requires an evaluation, because it is possible that he or she may have got himself or herself getting abused by another adult. That possibility also is there. Or it may be that he may not be aware of that this activity is something, it falls under the purview of abuse. So definitely both children, they require evaluation. So then the question about whether this child will develop a psychiatric disorder. So if it is a single instance of just a non-contact abuse without much of threat or coercion, and if there is the child doesn't, if child's support system is good, and if child doesn't engage in any avoidant kind of coping strategies, the risk of development of psychiatric disorders is much less. And even otherwise also, psychiatric disorders are seen in only about 60 to 70% of children, and about 20 to 30% they may actually they may not show any clear symptoms of psychiatric disorders. The child may show some initial behaviors like clinging behavior to the parent, because being an young child, they may have some sleep difficulties or some clinging behaviors, and may show some anger or aggression or some anxiety, which may be or brief lasting. And typically we see these children beyond 2 or 3 months, they are doing well. And if the parents normalize the routine of the child, and if they provide a lot of support, and if they handle the other child like that 15-year-old and provide some support to him or her, that should be fine.
Okay. Thank you, sir. We'll go with the next. Go ahead with the next question. How long does it take to come out of the trauma of childhood sexual abuse? Can one come out of it and live the life normally? Were any one of you able to completely cure a patient? Dr. Vaishyanti, can you start with the answer?
I would like to say that recovery is not a product. Okay, it's a process of transformation of self, and
Okay.
into understanding what really happened and what part of it was disempowerment, and to be able to reclaim sexuality as the most intimate expression of uh, love and affection between two partners rather than as an act to be used or abused for pleasure and to for cruelty also, because um, rape or child abuse is an act of violence,
Okay.
not just that of and violence giving pleasure to somebody. So this is something that one has to understand in the process of recovery. Okay, and it's a process of transformation of the self. And
Okay.
every 10 years or 15 years, people keep revising their opinion of their own abuse, from what I
Okay.
have seen. So they become, not that they forgive the abuser, they get a more mature understanding of what happened. And many of them become altruistic and help many others. And yes, that kind of cure, as if it never happened, that will not happen. But the person will always remember what happened, but they do not relive what
Okay.
happened. So they don't have
Okay.
flashbacks, they don't have nightmares, and it's not controlling their intimate partnerships in a major way. I already described one patient who is in her late 20s now and is in a successful relationship. And I know at least uh, a dozen or even more than that number of women who are living reasonably healthy, normal sexual partnerships and lives despite child sexual abuse, and some of
Okay.
which was quite serious and multiple offenders, gang rape, etc. Even they
Okay.
have recovered. Okay,
Okay.
so human resilience is something commendable.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for the answer. Um, we'll go ahead with one audience question, which one of the participants, one of the audience members has asked us now. How should one uh, how should one respond when an adult comes out and talks about their childhood sexual abuse and are still suffering from nightmares? So, Dr. John,
Hello.
hello.
Yeah. Uh, this is something, no, we see that the person has uh, continuation of nightmares probably for uh, a long period of time. As Dr. Vaijayanti mentioned in her presentation earlier, that there could be some reminders that has triggered this occurrence of these nightmares again during the adult period.
Okay.
So we need to explore that those kind of reminders, and we need to. It could be some kind of sensory phenomena, or it could be a particular environment to which the person has been again exposed, or it could be even a relationship, no, that reminds the person of the past abuse which they have suffered. So we
Okay.
need to explore these things, and definitely we need to work with that person closely. He or she would definitely require mental support to address these nightmares.
Okay. There are like two more questions in the document that I've sent. I've missed one actually. I'll come to the last one in a moment. Is there a correlation that the person who has experienced harassments in his childhood may do the same to other children? Dr. Vajanti, answer.
Identifying oneself with the abuser as a way to overcome the disempowerment and helplessness of the experience of victimization is quite kind of well known. and it's literally like senior students who ragged a junior, and the junior is waiting for the next set of juniors to come so that can I rag this person. So not everybody does that. So you do find that it's a very small number who resort to that. Not everyone does that. In fact, many people feel that what happened to me should never ever happen to anybody else. So it's not necessary that people who have been harassed are going to harass somebody. In fact, they're so scared of harassing somebody that when they come to that position, they literally leave that seat and run away sometimes. So it's kind of not at all true that once a person who has been abused is also going to become an abuser. Never. You can't generalize like that, and you need not be scared like that.
Okay. Oh, thank you, ma'am. We'll go to the last question in the document that I've shared. After that, we have 3 more questions. If we have time, we can take them. What happens if the victim refuses to believe that he or she was abused and instead turns the entire experience into a pleasurable one in his or her mind over the course of time? Why does this happen? Is there any way to change this? Dr. John, can you take this?
Yeah, I think to answer that question, like this experience, what the person has gone through, first and foremost, if they narrate that experience, and we have to see whether it falls under the purview of abuse. You know, more so when we are talking about child sexual abuse today. Child sexual abuse has a clear definition, and that means the person who experiences that has to be in the childhood period, that is below the age of 18. And also usually it's very common that the perpetrator is one who is older to the victim, and who has some form of power or authority over this child. And also we see that almost 40 to 50% times the abuser is someone who is unknown, or even sometimes even 70% times in some of the literature to the victim. That's a known perpetrator. And also there is a process of grooming. And also I described the Finkelhorst model, wherein the first part, the traumatic sexualization, they confuse the victim by showing a lot of love and affection, becoming close. And also sometimes they may target the vulnerable kind of victims. So that means like where lack of parental supervision may be there, or there may be one of the parent being having a physical illness or mental illness, whatever it is. So then this person narrates that they are confused about that whole experience, and sometimes in their mind they think that this experience may be the right kind of experience, whatever it is. So that is the confusion about that experience, and we need to explore that and provide the proper explanation to them. Definitely no abuse experience can be taken as pleasurable or something like. So abuse is abuse. We need to be very clear about that. And no, for that matter, no child, as Dr. Vijayendra rightly pointed out, this is a violence. So no child should be subjected to abuse. So that we need to be very clear, and this needs to be communicated.
Okay. There are 2 more questions which are asked by the participants. So after that, I think we're done. We'll take just 2 more questions. I hope that's okay.
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah. So the question is, I am a male. As a teenager, I kissed my cousin brother. I did not force him or hurt him. I just wanted to know if I sexually abused him or it was just sexual experimentation at puberty. I kind of feel guilty and disgusted too, as I am not gay. Also, I have observed my cousin sister with lust during my teenage years, although I did not touch her. I kind of feel guilty for that too. Can you please comment on this?
Yeah, I think some of these experiences during the adolescent or teenage years are quite common. This is not a rare kind of instance what we are listening to. And so first and foremost, that first instance where he mentions that he has kissed that cousin. So we have to explore as to whether how the other person felt about that experience, and see, sometimes, as I was talking about this normal sexual exploration that happens during the adolescence phase, and more so if were to happen in situations where the adult supervision is not there, and also maybe just a one instance, and later on, like, they didn't continue this kind of pattern, or no coercion or threat, or kind of force was involved, then it's not abuse. This person need not feel guilty. At the same time, the person also may not, person should not think that his orientation is of a particular nature, like he has become a same-sex orientation in nature. So they should not get confused about that. And also, with regards to the other point which you mentioned, like saying that looking at the cousin who is a girl, and very lustfully, and but not committing any sexual act, that in itself doesn't constitute an abuse. So and it's very common in adolescents and even young adults that the sexual attractions, what we call, sometimes even maybe towards some of the own relatives, or towards the other, could be colleagues or other people. It can happen sometimes. We may get those kind of feelings, but at the same time, I think what is important is whether they are able to control their behaviors, whether they are able to stay within the whatever the boundaries, their boundaries. That is very important. So either you don't violate the other person's boundary, you don't allow the other person to violate your boundary. That is something very important. And so long as it doesn't happen like this, that it's not abuse, and the person need not be guilty.
Okay. Thank you, sir. We have one more question. It's slightly lengthy. I think I'll read it out slowly. I got sexually abused by my neighbor who was 70 years old when I was 13. After that, I disclosed it in my family and no one believed it as he was very old. The common response was, he is an old man, just forgive him. The only one who helped me during this crisis was my cousin sister, and she helped me carry through my issues. 4 years ago, she untimely passed away, the cousin sister, and that triggered a cycle of traumatic memories that I confided in started to come back, including this abuse. I was having flashbacks with vivid images, depression, suicidal thoughts, and anxiety disorder. For the last few years, I have been attending therapy and have made considerable improvement. My state is usually highly anxious with social anxiety and can't be productive no matter how I try. Sometimes my actions are highly incongruent. I can't remember many of my childhood memories right now and have a constant feeling I don't deserve to be loved. How can I regain my self-confidence back? Due to the pandemic, therapy has been all over the place for the last 4 to 5 months. So I hope you can get most of it.
Yes. I would like to answer the question. Like, the perpetrator here is a neighbor who is a 70-year-old person, and that clearly shows that we can't stereotype the perpetrator, saying that they are those young men who will look very aggressive, and who have a prior history of any violence towards others, and all this kind of, and who are typically people who are unknown, and so all these students, so anyone for that matter can be a perpetrator, and it's very well known that 70% of the times the perpetrator is a known person, either a neighbor, or it could be even a family member, a relative. So that's where I think, and then this girl, when she disclosed that experience, it's very common that this is the reason why many children, they don't disclose. Almost 60-70% times during the childhood, the disclosure gets either delayed or not disclosed at all, because basically the adults, they don't trust this. They say that how can a 70-year-old person perpetrate this? What are you talking like? He's like your grandparent. He is much older than your parent, and And also there may be a lot of other dynamics involved, especially when the perpetrator is someone who belongs to the family, like say an uncle or somebody. So there are a lot of other dynamics that may be playing, like especially the financial kind of supports or other things, where the parents themselves may not support. So that's where it further, and they may in turn blame the child, saying that, no, you are just blaming a old person, and no, you just have to simply forgive and forget, kind of thing. And so this was as a kind of all these negative feelings, the low self-esteem, the grief, depression, and her all these things were repressed in her mind for a long time. And then she opened up to this friend who recently has passed away, unfortunately. And there is again this recent passing away of the friend has created a grief, kind of a loss, basically a very immense loss for this person, and a grief reaction. And in that grief reaction, she again got these traumatic memories of that abuse from the childhood. And she will definitely require support from like she has to see whether in her immediate social network no, it's not possible to get the same kind of replacement. Like she can't get that friend only in her life, because unfortunately she has passed away. But within the network available, she has to see whether anyone else she can depend on for them for support. Then also I think the if for like at the earliest no, because now I can understand the COVID situation and all, but as and when the situation normalizes, she has to get the therapy support. That is very important. If these symptoms are going to continue, if she's going to, if that is going to affect her functioning, so she has to get the support.
I would just like to add that following disclosure secondary trauma is quite common. And what has happened is she has been gaslighted into thinking that was I really abused or was I not abused? Was it truly abusive to me or was it not? So this external validation, yes, in fact, you were abused. It doesn't matter what his age is. It doesn't matter how respectable he is. What he did to you is abuse if you feel it is abuse. This is what that other friend has validated her distress and validated that experience for her. But she needs to develop it internally, because you're not going to get external validation again and again in life. And if she is an adult today and she has a healthy heterosexual relationship where she has experienced pleasure, then she'll know for sure that what was abuse, because you know what is consensual, what is pleasurable versus what is non-consensual, where you were objectified, where your body was used as an instrument of pleasure for somebody else. And that is violation, and that is disempowerment. And you don't need external validation for that. You need to become strong in your internal validation of that experience as abuse. Abuse is abuse. Zero tolerance to abuse. No matter who the abuser is. Abuser can be teacher, abuser can be older, abuser can be father, it can be uncle, it can be anybody. But an abuser, first and foremost, is an abuser because he abused you, and that is your reality. And you need to be very confident of that, and do not allow others to distort your reality, question your subjective reality by their objective interpretations. That can be done to a child, I agree, but it should not be done to an adult. This has to be upgraded version of the adult has to come. Right now, this person is still behaving like a child, is what I can see. The upgradation of an adult, when it comes, you'll be very sure what is abuse and what is not abuse. Okay, so that is somehow lacking, because the reference will be pleasurable experience. You need to have a reference point. What is not abuse? If you experience that, then you'll know what is abuse. Okay, if you have never experienced what is not abuse, then perhaps you don't have a reference point. So you need to do some introspection here. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. With that, I think we are done with the questions. Yeah, I thank both the panelists for sparing their time and discussing such an important topic. I think it has been useful to many of the participants and the people who have asked the questions. Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Professor Anil also. Yeah.